A Traveler in Time by Alison Uttley. Chapter 9. Haymaking took the whole of the June days, for the men began when I was asleep in the morning, and the work never stopped till the moon came out and the bats flew in and out of the barns. The haystacks were growing in the grassy yard by the church, and the great wains of new hay came lurching top-heavy along the lanes and meadows past the tower. Sometimes I rode on top of the grey gold load with Patrick, my favourite Irishman, beside me. I looked up at the tents of green leaves waving above me, with clear light dripping like water upon the ever-changing colors of the shadowed hay. Time and space seemed to slip away. I was riding on a cloud, not on the earth at all. Sometimes I thought I heard a voice calling, "Penelope, Penelope!" But it was only the song of the cuckoo. Sometimes I heard the cries of huntsmen, and saw him, flying horse's gallop over the fields to the opposite wooded hills. But when I raised myself, it was only the cloud shadows racing up the valleys to the horizon. One day, when I leaned idly against the churchyard wall, waiting for the hay cart to be emptied, I heard Anthony's deep voice talking to his wife, and for a moment I saw him. The garden at Thacker's, which adjoined the church, changed before my eyes. The smooth lawn of other days spread from the little croft. The cedar tree came from the shade. Young Mistress Babington's hand was on Anthony's shoulder. Her pretty face was white and drawn. She seemed to be pleading with him. I saw his plum-colored cloak thrown back, and I caught the glint of a signet ring he wore. "Mary, dear heart, I have pledged my life to save her. I am bound by sacred vows, and I am ready to die in her service. I must keep my word to the Catholic Church and the Queen." "Your duty lies here, Anthony, at Thacker's. These people are your people, Sicily and old John Derbyshire, and the folk of the valleys and hills. Life is sweet, Anthony. We are only on the threshold of marriage. We should have many years of happiness before us, carrying on the work of your forefathers, caring for the land, living a quiet country life, serene and secure, in this valley where all is so beautiful. Stay here, dear Anthony, don't leave me again. I can't bear the separation and the agony of fear for your safety." She stretched out her hand with a sweeping gesture to the warm green woods and the sun-freckled hills. Out of the depths of the blue sky swooped a hawk, and the plover cowered in the bracken. "Oh, take care," I wanted to cry, but no voice came, and I beat my hands in vain. Anthony put his arm around his wife and pointed to the church tower with its row of shields. "Foi et tu, Mary. I must keep faith with the three, Mary, Queen of Heaven, Mary, the Queen in captivity, and Mary, my wife." "Mary of many sorrows." The whisper came like a breath from her lips. The voices were silent, the figures faded, and I saw only the massive yews, somber and remote, reminding me that they had witnessed scenes of parting and sadness for centuries. They had shared the life of Thacker's with its births and deaths, and caught the essence of sorrow in their funereal boughs. I went into the house and climbed the twisted stair to the landing, seeking to enter that remote world, but not succeeding, although I knew it was close to me. The door was waiting to be opened if only I could see it. That evening the men worked late to finish, and I raked the fields in the dusk with Alison, stopping to pick the dog roses which were like white stars in the hedges, then hastening after my sister. Dumbledores boomed as they struck our dresses, a hedgehog walked in the path, and we could hear the barking of a fox in the wood. Night creatures were about, and a vibrant stillness was in the air, so that every sound was magnified, and the voices of the men echoed against the tower. My mind was half with the haymakers, and half with those others of 300 years before, for that time seemed very close to me. With my feet I walked the same warm ground that Anthony and Frances Babington had trod. I smelled the same roses blooming on the hedges, creeping over old barns, undisturbed for generations, renewing themselves, yet always the same. Poor Mary Babington may have wept under one of the yews and pressed her face against its trunk. Dame Cicely Taberner picked herbs in the garden and stooped over the bushes of rue and wormwood as I bent my face to the olive leaves. I rode on the last load of hay, under the pricking stars, and the horses drew me to the stackyard, where I could see the great haystacks already built silvery gray and rich with heavy fragrance. They seemed half as high as the tower from where I crouched, and I was proud of Uncle Barnabas's famous stacks. I slid down and waited, and the moon rose white-faced from the hills. It was a strange, unearthly scene. The men like shadows, the dark horses, the church soaring under the new light. The fields lay smooth as lawns, pale in the moon rays, and the horses whinnied with pleasure as Ian opened the gate and turned them loose. Hay harvest was done, and all the fun and the hard labor was finished. The land was resting after its close communion with man. Aunt Tissy called me from the kitchen door and waved her apron to me. Another voice seemed to come trilling like a bird in the night air. I shivered and ran indoors to the farm kitchen and washed my streaky face in the brass bowl at the sink. Then I changed my dress and took my supper to the garden, where I sat under the oak tree, listening to the talk of the men. "That's enough for tonight. We've done beat the weather this year. Come rain, come snow, we've beat it," said Uncle Barnabas. "Glory be to God," returned Patrick. "Who's that ghost that's a-sitting on the seat?" asked Uncle Barney, looking over the gate. "Why, it's Penelope. Come along in, my girl. You'll get your cough back again and be abed, and we'll have to send for the doctor, and I don't think he'll know the way, for he's not been at Thacker's for half a century." So I finished my supper and went in, for there was no way to that hidden world. We had great rejoicings the next day, for Uncle Barnabas kept up the old traditions of his forefathers, and there was ale and boiled beef and suet dumplings for the Irish. I helped to set the table in the grass plat, and Aunt boiled the beef in the round, black kettle which she fetched down from her granary loft. I had seen it before, I told her, but she said that was impossible unless I had been up in the dark chamber, poking about among the rats. "I've seen it hung over the fire," I protested. "Nay, we only use it twice a year, for hay harvest and corn harvest, and sometimes for the Christmas hams," said she. Then I remembered it was the one I had seen in the Babington household, hanging over the great open hearth with venison simmering in it. "It's mortal old," laughed Aunt Tissy, looking at the enormous iron vessel with its 4 little legs. "Maybe over 100 years. What do you think, Brother Barnabas?" "Nigher 200, said Uncle Barney. "Nearer 300, I added triumphantly. I changed to my new green tussar and brushed my hair and fastened the picture of the Queen of Scots round my neck. Then I went to the harvest supper. The Irishmen were eating their meal at the long trestle table, such as those others used in the Thacker's kitchen, and Uncle Barnabas sat with them, his Sunday necktie looking very smart, his round red face beaming on his friends, as he drank his ale and listened to the chatter and jokes which the men tossed from one to another. Ian sat there too, practicing the role of farmer, imitating Uncle Barnabas. Aunt Tissy dished up the spotted dick, as big as a cannonball, and carried it out all steaming hot. I cut the slices and gave each man his portion, dredged with sugar and curled with butter on the top. In the pudding a bright shilling was hidden, and each man hunted in his suety portion. I was glad when it settled on Patrick's plate, and he nodded and smiled over it. When all was eaten, the Irishmen gave a concert, singing ballads and dancing Irish jigs. "What is that pretty picture Miss Penelope has round her neck?" asked Patrick. "It's a locket we found a while back," said Uncle Barney. "It's not pure gold. I wish it was. We could do with some of that." "She's a nice-looking colleen," said another. "Somebody must have loved her." "It's Mary, Queen of Scots," I said proudly. And as I spoke, I saw Francis standing by the door, in his fur-edged doublet and long leather boots. On his wrist he carried a falcon, whose fierce eyes gazed beyond me as if seeing something afar. Nobody took any notice of the gallant and splendid figure, who strode across the yard and went out through the gate. He was unseen by all, but one of the Irishmen shivered as if he felt a cold wind, and he made the sign of the cross. "Holy Mother, I thought there was somebody, he muttered, but the others were unaware of his start, and he drank a mug of ale. "Somebody walking on my grave," said he. I left the harvest feast and crossed the lawn, following the dim figure. And as I went, the sounds of the singing died away, and the scene was blotted out. Anthony sat under the tree, reading a book called A Book of Diverse Prayers for Sundry Saints. I stood waiting for him to look up. Perhaps I was invisible to him, as Francis had been to those at the farm. He put down the book and murmured a prayer aloud, an invocation to the Queen. "Most gracious Majesty," he whispered, and I felt that he saw the Queen before him as he spoke. "Beloved Majesty, most gallant and fearless of women, defiant of fortune, uncowed by years of captivity, but never captured in soul, you will ride free of them all. Your beauty will reign over us, you who already reign in our hearts." Then Francis came up, and both of them saw me. "I was thinking for the Queen," said Anthony, smiling gently, with no surprise at my appearance, as if I were part of his dream. "Tell Penelope about her," said Francis, taking my arm. She is one with us, a part of Thacker's. Thacker's is like a rock, sheltering us. Tell her, Anthony, for she has never seen her grace." Then Anthony spoke of the valiance of the Scottish queen, of the escapes she had attempted in past days. "She gloried in brave deeds," he cried, his eyes flashing with adoration. "She escaped from the Dunbar alone, disguised as a page boy, in 1567, when Anthony himself was a child. The tale of her bravery was told to him by his father, and his childish heart was fired with her deeds. His games were of escapes, and he climbed from the Thacker's windows at night to be caught and sent back to bed. He hid himself in haystacks with a parcel of bread and wine, pretending to be the fugitive queen while his parents sought for him. She nearly escaped a year later, disguised as a laundress," he continued. "Then Willie Douglas, not much older than Francis here, helped her to escape from Loch Leven in a rowing boat. Only the perfidy of the rowers who saw her lovely face when her hood was blown back by the raging wind betrayed her. Then again she escaped, and slept in the open fields, with sour milk to drink and a handful of oatmeal for food. Hunger and cold were her bedfellows, darkness her cloak, yet she never felt fear, not even when all men's hands seemed against her. Not even during that terrible ride through Edinburgh streets with a crowd crying out on her did she show fear." He stopped, his mind on the wonder of his queen, and I waited, enthralled by his tales of her valour. "Now she will escape again, disguised as Anthony Babington," said he quietly, "and this time she will be free. My plans are carefully laid. She demands courage and self-denial from her followers, and we gladly risk our lives for her. A spirit lives in that frail and beautiful body, such as was never on earth before." "Tell her all. Let her know our plans," implored Francis. "She may help us by her foreknowledge." So Anthony told me his plans to save Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland, she who was prisoner to Queen Elizabeth, she who was liberty itself, whose other name was freedom. He spoke with quick staccato words, and little gestures such as a foreigner makes. His eyes blazed like stars, and Francis stood with lowered head, listening as if he heard for the first time. Anthony went back in a memory to the old days, when he was a page at the court at Sheffield, the little intimate court of the captive queen. "But it was earlier still that I loved her," he mused. "I think I loved her from the very beginning of my life, and I never remember the time when I did not know her name. When my mother told me fairy tales or deeds of daring, Mary Stuart was the heroine. When I heard tales of adventure, there were stories about the Queen of Scotland. She rode through my dreams at night, starry-eyed and beautiful. She lived in my daydreams. When at last I was a young page at her court, I wrote sonnets to her, and burned them, and wrote others, protesting my admiration and devotion, then tearing them up as unworthy of my queen." A light came to his eyes as he spoke of those days, when he served Mary Stuart, and sang in madrigals to delight her, and she joined the fair-haired boy in his songs. She played chess with him, and made him read to her from her book of Ronsard's poems, the poet of her glorious youth. He had stumbled with the language till she laughingly bade him stop. She couldn't bear his Derbyshire French any longer, she had protested. He spoke of Wingfield Manor, a noble house, though small, only a few miles away over the wooded hills which swept up to the sky behind Thacker's. The Queen was shortly to be moved there, and already preparations were being made to accommodate her and her retinue of 50. 50! Once she had 400 of her own household, and now they allow her only 50, sighed Anthony. Sir Ralph Sadleir, who is to have charge of her grace, begged the Earl of Shrewsbury to keep her at Sheffield, for he would rather guard her with 50 men in that strong castle than with 300 at Wingfield. But the Earl refused to keep her any longer. "His sympathies are with Mary Stuart," interrupted Francis. "His heart has been touched by her beauty and tragedy, and the Countess Bess is suspicious and jealous of the Queen, and has stirred up strife and misunderstanding. I believe the Earl would be glad if Mary Stuart escaped." "So long as she isn't in his custody," agreed Anthony. "He might lose his head otherwise. So it is much better for the Queen that she is going to a country house, unfortified, with scarce room for the men who will guard her." Then he told me that at Wingfield there was a secret passage underground, of which only the Earl and the family of Babington knew. It led to Thacker's, but nobody was certain where was the exit, for it had been unused for many generations, and was broken down and silted with earth and crumbled rocks. If they could reopen this ancient tunnel, the Queen could enter and escape. At the Wingfield end it went only a short distance and was blocked by fallen debris. It was obviously too dangerous to work there, and the passage must be cleared from the Thacker's end. At Thacker's there were 2 or 3 false entrances, and they were digging to find the true tunnel. One passage had already been excavated, but it went to the solid rock, and now another was being explored. Tom Snowball was working with other men, trusty lead miners, who were used to breaking the rocks and tunneling in their search for lead in the hills. They were devout Catholics, who had come from over Tandy, where there were lead mines, and they would work underground. "Why was there a tunnel, Master Anthony?" I asked. "Nobody knows that, Penelope," he replied. "It must have been dug hundreds of years ago, in more troublous times even than ours, for the escape of fugitives from Wingfield, which is a very old manor. Many great houses had their secret passages, with false openings to screen the real ones, and we are seeking among the mounds of grass and piled rock in the churchyard. The Queen will enter at Wingfield, and she will creep along the narrow passage to Thacker's, maybe in floods of water, and she will bend and have to go down on her hands and knees in places, but she won't care," cried Francis. "It'll be a fine adventure, and when she comes to Thacker's she will be cared for, hidden away for a night to rest, and then off to France when it is safe. She will go disguised as Anthony, for they are the same height, or maybe like a market woman riding pillion, dressed in Dame Cicely's oldest clothes, and Anthony garbed like a farmer. At our darling Thacker's she will hide, I thought, and she will sleep in the best bedchamber under the patchwork quilt. Aunt Cicely will warm the bed with a warming pan, and for the Queen will be cold and tired after her journey. I shall carry hot water upstairs and wash her feet, and fetch a clean towel from the press for her lily-white hands. She will go muffled, half-faced, riding through the hills and woods, and nobody will recognize her when she is dressed in a man's clothes. I shall ride with her as her brother or servant," Francis continued. "And I, too," I implored. "I can ride and endure hardships. Take me, too, Francis." He laughed and shook his head, but Anthony did not hear. He was deep in thought, his eyes on the distance. He strode across the lawn and entered the house, and in a minute I could see him at his open window, quill in hand, writing rapidly. "And if she doesn't escape? Suppose she is caught, or somebody tells?" I asked, with a queer half-memory of disaster nagging at me like an aching tooth. What it was I could not remember, but Francis knew, for he stopped me from thinking of it, and I never said the words of my fatal pre-knowledge. "Come with me," said he, and ran back across the cobbled stable-yard, where lately I had left the harvest supper. Horses stamped, grooms whistled, a servant woman laughed and talked and fluttered into the house, her white folded cap bright and clean. At the great door of the kitchen stood my Aunt Cicely, in her white apron over her dark blue bodice and padded quilted petticoat. Her thick leather shoes were clasped with narrow thongs, and she tapped the stone sill impatiently with her wooden heel. Her hands were on her hips, she was full of laughter, and her head bobbed in its little white ruff, nodding to me as I came through the gate, as if she had lately seen me. "There you are, my chuck! Master Francis has found you!" A rich smell of roasted meats came steaming out, and I could hear the sounds of frizzling and hissing fats. A voice sang a haunting melody, and the thin, lovely tones of a harp came from the house. I asked Aunt Cicely who it was, for the music was strangely beautiful. "Wandering minstrel from Galway. He's travelling the country playing his songs, and he'll sleep here a few nights before he goes on. We are glad to get the news where these bards bring, for they sit in kitchen and hall, and they hear many things which would be hidden. This man has been at Sheffield Castle, and although he did not see her grace, he brought secret word that she will move in September. He is a devout man, and with his songs he can go where others cannot, for he is simple, without any guile or treachery." I saw the old man with tangled hair and beard sitting in the corner of the kitchen, with the maids listening to his music. He moved thin, crooked fingers over the harp strings and sang as if unconscious of his country audience. Jude stood near, watching his expression, staring at his lips as if to catch his words. Tabitha poured soup into a bowl and took it to the musician, and each one tried to honor and please him. As the music drifted, soft and clear, through the room, I remembered another music there, and for a moment I saw Uncle Barnabas playing his accordion with his work-hardened hands. I wished to enter and listen, but Francis beckoned me to follow him. He took me across the grass to the church, and into the vestry where a pile of spades and mattocks rested. The church was sweet and clean, for Dame Cicely had it scrubbed each week, and fresh herbs were strewn in the pews. There was a smell of rosemary and balm, and the cool odor of green rushes from the brookside, which were soft as velvet under my feet as I stood in a familiar pew. There was a heavy tapestry curtain across one end of Mistress Babington's pew to screen her from the congregation, and cushions and footstools were placed ready for her. In the windows shone the lovely painted glass, and by the font was the ancient clock complaining with the wheezy voice of an old man. Then we went to the churchyard, where Francis showed me a heap of brown earth and broken rock. "That is where we have sunk a shaft, one gang digging, another removing the rock and soil, and timbering the roof where necessary. All in the house are sworn to secrecy. The wenches in the kitchen go home at dark to the village. Only Dame Cicely and Tabitha and Phoebe stay here to look after the household, and Marjorie, Mistress Babington's personal maid." I went back to the house to help in the kitchen. Aunt Cicely was busy with her broths and roasted meats, for there was heavy work to be done, preparing for the miners, storing food for the night work. I made the sweets for the gentlefolk under Aunt Cicely's guidance. I ground the almonds and mixed them with honey to a paste, and then I molded them into shapes with colorings from a row of jars, green and brown and rosy pink. I fashioned little fruits and nuts and acorns and laid them on a dish to dry. Through the window, I could see the miners come from the tunnel and enter the great barn. They played skittles and slept, awaiting their turn to go back. Tabitha took them food, for they were not asked to the house. "It's a lead vein we are seeking," they spread the report. "A fine vein of lead which will bring money to Thacker's." The villagers rejoiced, for they knew lead had been found on the other side of the hill at Tandy for centuries. Lead mines were worked there in Roman times, and every day a train of pack mules went down the lane to the west of Thacker's with panniers containing loads of lead ore to be smelted at the little cupola in the valley. It was no lead vein they had found in the earth, as we knew quite well, but it served as a blind for the curious who might ask about the digging. Aunt Cicely gave me the dish of sweetmeats and a silver jug of canary wine to take to Mrs. Babington's parlour. I went across the hall, staying for a minute to gaze up at the great sword and longbow which Master Thomas Babington had used at Agincourt, for to me they were the most romantic things in the house. Then I tapped at the parlour door and entered timidly, for I was unused to this service. But before me I saw the old parlour of Thacker's, changed and made beautiful. In the window seat was young Mistress Babington in her rich blue silk dress over a kirtle of night blue. Her ruff was stiffly starched and pleated, and round her neck hung a gold chain with a pomander which scented the room. On her fair hair was a lace coif which gave her a matronly look, although she must have been scarcely 23. She sat with a piece of embroidery before her, and I watched her needle go in and out as she deftly painted in silks a picture of Joseph's dream. There were the golden sheaves bowing down to a sheaf in the center, and in the background were the trees of the wood's edge. Over all the sun shone with a smile on his yellow face, and long beams pointing like fingers at the sheaf. I recognized the scene as Uncle Barnabas's great cornfield on the borders of the wood, and I knew that Mistress Babington had chosen the rich old ploughland as the subject of her embroidery. She saw me glance curiously at the work as I walked across and curtsied to her, and she smiled and showed me her stitches of yellow and gold silk. Then I held out the fluted dish with the little almond and honey sweetmeats shaped like acorns and leaves which I had helped Aunt Cicely to make, and she put one in her mouth, thanking me. "You have made them as if you created things of beauty, instead of confections to be eaten," she said, and I was glad, for I had taken great pains with these sweets. Then I saw others, the girl who had scorned me at the fair, and a priest who watched me with keenly searching eyes, so that I felt uncomfortable. Anthony laughingly called to them, and the priest walked across to me. He muttered something in Latin and pointed to the dogs which had retreated from me, with their hair on end, growling and shaking. "Nay, Penelope is a friend," explained Anthony. "She's Dame Cicely Taberner's niece from Chelsea. She is of the family which has lived here as long as the Babingtons, which shall live here till we go, and maybe will survive us in that future when all shall be changed. They are bound to us by generations of service. They are true as steel. Though not of our faith, they understand and are always loyal." The girl came forward, her dazzling white skin and her flaming hair enhanced by the rich brown velvet dress she wore. Lace-edged lawn hung from her wrists, and a ruff of lace tied with silver beads stood up round her slim young throat. She moved with a superb arrogance, her long body swaying in the stiff skirts like a sunflower. "So here's the wench who rides with Cousin Francis as an equal," she cried scornfully, and she stared at me with hard eyes, and her thin scarlet lips curled in a cruel way. "Why shouldn't I?" I retorted. "Francis asked me to ride, and this is a free country." "A free country! Harkee! Not for Babington with Queen Eliza on the throne," snapped the girl bitterly. "You forget yourself, coz," said Mistress Babington quietly. "We are all free in this year of grace, 1584. What we shall be in 100 years' time I know not, but now we are free." All except one, and she the greatest of all, said Anthony. But, Cousin Arabella, seat yourself, and eat a sugared comfit. These are such as we seldom have. They are so delicately made. He held out the sweetmeats to her, but she pushed them away. Cousin Anthony, Cousin Mary, will you let me be insulted? Arabella stormed, stamping her small foot. Send her away. Back to the kitchen where she belongs, a scullion and a dishclout. Silence, Arabella. Hold your tongue, girl. This is not your house, and you must restrain yourself here. Penelope is my guest. Where is your jewel? She told you she had found it. She's the one who prophesied evil, worse than my father's prophecy, cried Arabella. Didn't you, wench? You can't deny it. Didn't you say her grace would be executed? Nay, you said stranger things than that. Have you dealings with the unholy ones? Who is a spy sent here by Walshingham's underlings? She pushed her flaming face close to mine and suddenly boxed my ears so that I reeled. Answer me, slut! She cried. Arabella! Silence! Shouted Anthony, white with anger. How dare you? Leave the room! Arabella swept out with her long dress trailing in a royal way, her eyes blazing, her hands twitching as if she wished to strike me again. I rubbed my smarting cheek, bewildered by the sudden onslaught. The priest hurried after Bella, and the door was shut. Penelope, help me to eat these sweetmeats, said Mistress Babington in a calm voice, as if nothing had happened. Sit down by me, and forget Arabella. She is jealous of our honour, and her love for her Grace of Scotland inflames her. You must excuse her. She pointed to a low velvet seat, and, shaken and unhappy, I sat down. Mistress Babington went to a cupboard and brought a pierced silver box. She removed the lid and held out golden butter drops. I made these myself, Penelope, she said. These are made from a new substance called sugar, which is too expensive a luxury for the kitchen. I should think so, said Anthony, dipping his fingers in the box. 20 shillings a pound. Sugar is scarce and comes in our ships across the seas from the Spice Islands. I have been talking about you to Dame Cicely, Mistress Babington continued, and I want you to belong to my household. Would you like that? Her sad eyes were fixed upon me as she waited for my reply. I should like it very much, I replied. Thank you, Mistress Babington, but I have to go home. I couldn't stay here always. I have to go home. You can read Latin with Father Hurd, went on Mistress Babington, unheeding, and I will study French with you. You shall be my personal maid and companion. You will work in the kitchen with your aunt, for that is good for you. I, too, often help with baking the small breads and making the dishes for feast days. But I will train you in other ways, for you have talent. Your fingers are clever, you can draw and model, and may become a good embroideress. I saw you admiring my tapestry of Joseph's dream. Yes, it would be well for all of us if you are here. Anthony's blue eyes turned from his wife and watched me keenly, as if he wished to read my thoughts. My wife will be very much alone, and you will be a companion for her, said he, and his grave words had a double meaning for me which I could not miss. Alone, how terribly alone she would be, I knew, and I realized for a moment the agony in which Mistress Babington lived, the dreams from which she awoke terrified with thoughts of martyrdom for her husband, of hanging, and all the barbarities by which traitors to Queen Elizabeth met their ends. Then a flash of memory came to me, tearing my breast with pain. My mother and father, my sister and brother, and Uncle Barnabas and Aunt Tissy. Suppose I could never get back, and those who loved me, those I loved, never saw me again. Those others, who were they? I was suddenly frightened. I must go, I said breathlessly. They are waiting. Who? Your aunt knows you are here. Who will be waiting? Penelope, you came freely from London to live here. Who waits? I couldn't remember, and I stood gazing round helplessly at the half-panelled walls with the candle sconces, the wide empty fireplace, the carved stool with its fringed velvet seat, the table with a basket of coloured wools and silks by Mistress Babington's high-backed chair, and the tapestry on her knee. I had no fear of the room, nor of the occupants who eyed me calmly. I didn't know what it was, this sudden panic of alarm. I stood there, looking from one to another, hesitating, when the door was flung open and Frances came in. Here you are, Penelope. Have they asked you to stay? You will, won't you? I'll teach you to shoot with the bow, and we will ride, and you shall learn never to fear. I was suddenly happy. Nothing could go wrong. I was safe. Yes, of course I'll stay. Why, I laughed, I've nowhere else to go. This is my home. Thacker's is my home. Indeed, I had forgotten all in the brightness which came in the room when the boy entered. Mistress Babington went across the floor to a little virginal in front of the window. She lifted the painted lid and dusted the ivory and ebony keys with a silk rag. On the lid's surface I saw a picture of blue sky and white cloud and a green flashing river flowing between dark trees foaming over rocks. "Do you recognize this?" she asked me, smiling. "Isn't it the valley where we rode to the fair?" I asked, but doubtfully, for the artist had used his freedom of imagination to make the rocks greater, the river wilder, than the one I knew. "Yes, it is the Darand, our beloved river. It was painted by a famous artist from Italy who once visited me. I look at this scene as I play the virginal, and I feel I am walking in the valley by the river, for I love the sound of water above all things." "You have the brook at your door, Mary," said Anthony, "and I would bring the river if I could." He went to her and leaned over the virginal as she played a sweet tinkling air like bells in a wood, or water dropping from a spring among meadow grasses. Then Francis and Anthony sang a madrigal with her, and I listened with delight. "And you? It's your turn, Penelope. Everybody sings in these days. Music is the possession of the poorest of the land, for we are all born with an instrument of our own." I was shy, but I wished to please them, and I remembered that Dame Cicely and Tabitha and Marjorie all sang unconcernedly, with no false modesty. But I could remember nothing except, "It was a lover and his lass with a keen Annie no," which I had sung 100 times, so I sang this falteringly, and when I finished they all applauded. Nobody knew it, and when I said it was by Shakespeare, Anthony had not heard of him. Mistress Babington took a manuscript book of music from a desk and showed it to me with great pride. I couldn't read the notes, for they were square, and the clefs were different, curled and decorated with flourishes. Delicate pictures were drawn in the margins, and the words were written in a good clear hand. "The Carol of Hunting," I read, and saw a sketch of a deer under a tree. "The Carol of Christmas" was another, and "Lulla, lulla, thou little tiny child." Mistress Babington took the book from me and propped it on the virginal. She sang King Henry's song, "The Holly and the Ivy," and we all joined in the chorus. "The rising of the sun, and the running of the deer, the playing of the merry organ, sweet singing in the choir." They were all songs of the countryside, she told me, and everybody in the villages could sing them, and at Christmas men would come to Thacker's and all would sing together. "Here's a new song I heard at Babington House last year when I was at Derby," said Mistress Babington, turning the pages of the book. "I copied it out along with others in my songbook. It had come from London, and it is a pretty ballad, which as ever I knew." She pointed with her slim finger, and Francis began to laugh. "That's my song, Sister Mary. That's a song I have taken for my own. Hearken to me sing it for you." His eyes twinkled with mischief, and he gave me a teasing sidelong look as he threw back his head and sang to Mistress Babington's accompaniment. "Thy gown was of the grassy green, thy sleeves of satin hanging by, which made thee be a harvest queen, and yet thou wouldst not love me. My gayest gelding I thee gave, to ride wherever liked thee. No lady ever was so brave, and yet thou wouldst not love me. Green sleeves was all my joy, green sleeves was my delight. Green sleeves was my heart of gold, and who but Lady Green Sleeves?" "Aunt Cicely will want me now," I excused myself, for my heart was aching with a strange foreboding. I gave a low curtsy and went out, leaving Francis at his song. Then I heard other music, a dancing merry jig. It was the Irishmen singing in the yard, and I wanted to go back to them before I was caught in the web of this beloved household. I went along the passage to the kitchen and looked in at the door. Tabitha and Marjorie were dipping long strings of rush pith into fats for the rushlights, and hanging them to dry. Jude sat on the hearth whittling a little figure out of wood. He looked up as I stood there, and stayed motionless, watching me. The spinning wheel clattered, and all the time another music came out of the air, calling me back. The music grew louder, and the rattle of the spinning wheel and the fierce heat of the fire were lost. Those in the room grew shadowy and pale, disappearing in the light which streamed through the open door. Jude held out a hand as if bidding me stay, but I stepped through the doorway to the yard. The Irishmen were singing, and Uncle Barnabas was playing his accordion just as I had left them. I put my hand up to my neck, and there hung the jewel. It was true. I could not take it to that other world. It had been found in the future, and there it must remain. I carried it upstairs thoughtfully and hung it on the wall. The Irishmen went away that night, and we all said good-bye to them and clasped their great hard hands. "God be with you till we meet again, Malachi and Patrick, Michael and Andrew," said Aunt Tissy. "God be with you too, Mrs. Taberner," they replied. And away they went, with their bundles on their backs and sticks in their hands, down the drive and away into the moonlit night. I sat with Uncle Barnabas on the seat under the oak tree, and we counted the shooting stars which whirled down the sky in streaks of fire. Every one was a soul going to heaven. Uncle Barnabas told me, and we both thought of those winged beings rushing through space. Behind us were the 4 new haystacks, standing like great scented houses, and from them came little rustles and murmurs as the hay settled and shifted itself, breathing and sighing into the fields. The church, too, seemed full of tiny sounds, rumbles and whispers as if it were uneasy. Then a screech owl swept silently from the belfry, startling me as it swooped across the lawn. Shadows and ghosts seemed to flit around us as we sat silently there. I thought of the Babington children, Anthony and his brothers and sisters. 5 little children once lived at Thacker's, and played round the haystacks and hid themselves in the great barn by the wall. 5 little Elizabethan children. The 2 girls in long full skirts which they lifted as they ran, the boys in country smocks. In and out of the shadows they ran, calling, "Cuckoo, cherry tree," to one another. Once I heard the click of a pickaxe and the rumble of a barrow, and I glanced up at Uncle Barnabas. "Rats," said he. "Rats in the churchyard, digging holes. We must have the rat catcher soon, or they'll be getting in church and frighten folk." He lifted himself slowly and stiffly from his seat, and together we walked indoors. There was the table spread with harvest dainties, junkets with nutmeg sprinkled on the top, raspberries and cream, and enormous curd pasties, quite 3 feet long, all golden brown and flecked with spice. "They won't last long," said Aunt Tissy, when we exclaimed with their sighs. "There's some wanted for the mole catcher, and a piece for the hedger, and some for the gamekeeper." I didn't sleep well that night. Perhaps it was the fault of the full moon looking at the window, or the mare cropping noisily in the field. The heavy scent of sweetbriar filled the bedroom, and I could remember Frances saying, "This hedge is eglantine. Why do you call it sweetbriar, Penelope?" I lay thinking of Frances's gay companionship, of Anthony's bravery, of Mistress Babington's sorrow, and as I tossed I could hear the thud of picks and shovels and the sound of feet moving softly over the grass. I got out of bed and looked through the curtains. The haystacks were silver under the moon, and the land seemed to be alert, listening. I thought I saw figures move across the yard. People walked from the dark door of the barn to the churchyard where a lantern gleamed. Was it lantern light or only the moon rays? Were the people only shadows? I lost sight of them as they dropped to earth, and I crept back to bed, my teeth chattering, and after a while I fell asleep.